The tanker sat low in the water, heavy with crude, and it was going nowhere. Not because of engine failure, not because of weather, because somewhere in the operations room of a Ukrainian naval drone unit, a targeting package had just been confirmed for a vessel anchored 2 kilometers off the Crimean coastline, in water Russia had considered, for nearly 3 years, its own private lake. The strike on that tanker near Yalta sent a message that no press release could have delivered more clearly, and the message was this: there is no safe anchorage left in the Black Sea for a ship that carries Russian oil. By the summer of 2026, the consequences of that message had compounded into something the Kremlin had no prepared answer for. 135 million barrels of Russian crude oil loaded onto tankers that could not move, could not deliver, could not be monetized. A floating warehouse stretching across the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, representing roughly a full month of Russia's pre-war export volume, stranded not by storm or mechanical failure, but by a campaign of naval drones that had made the math of transit insurance, port operations, and hull risk simply unworkable. This is the story of how Ukraine did not need to sink the Russian oil industry. It only needed to make the world's insurers decide it was not worth covering. And by the time we reach the end of this breakdown, you will understand exactly why the figure sitting in the Kremlin is now facing a fiscal tightening that no military countermeasure can quickly resolve, and why the tool that produced it was not a missile, not a bomber, not a submarine, but an unmanned boat carrying a shaped charge and a GPS receiver. Stay with us, because the mechanism here is as precise as a scalpel, and understanding it changes how you read every piece of economic news coming out of Moscow for the rest of this war. Let us start with the geography, because the geography is everything. The Black Sea is not open water. It is a semi-enclosed basin with 2 exits: the Bosphorus Strait, controlled by Turkey, which has invoked the Montreux Convention to block warship transit since February 2022, and the Kerch Strait, the narrow passage between Crimea and mainland Russia that links the Black Sea to the Sea of Azov. Those 2 choke points define the entire logistics problem Russia faces when it tries to move oil out of its southern ports. Novorossiysk, Russia's largest Black Sea oil terminal, sits on the eastern shore. From Novorossiysk, tankers must transit the basin, pass near contested waters, and then navigate through the Turkish straits to reach buyers in the Mediterranean and beyond. That route, which once moved roughly 1 million barrels per day at its peak loading rate, had by mid-2026 become one of the most economically hazardous shipping lanes on Earth. The reason for that hazard has a name. 2 names, in fact: Sea Baby and Barracuda. Sea Baby is the drone that changed the paradigm of naval unconventional warfare. Ukraine developed it domestically, refining the design through successive combat iterations beginning in 2022. By 2026, the operational variant was roughly 5 meters in length, displacing approximately 1 ton of material, propelled by a quiet electric drive system that kept its acoustic signature well below the detection threshold of standard naval hydrophone arrays deployed across Russian coastal defense zones. Its warhead, a shaped explosive charge in the range of 200 to 450 kilograms depending on the mission configuration, was not designed to send a vessel to the bottom of the sea in one catastrophic detonation. It was designed to breach a hull, flood a compartment, trigger a fire in a fuel-adjacent space, or simply arrive close enough to a tanker's flank that the hull damage assessment would make the vessel commercially uninsurable for the remainder of its working life. Barracuda operates on a slightly different principle. Where Sea Baby is a surface-running craft, Barracuda variants reported in open-source intelligence by early 2026 included semi-submersible profiles capable of riding low in the water, presenting a radar return roughly equivalent to a piece of floating debris. The 50 N6A radar aboard Russian coastal defense installations, the same targeting sensor used in the S-350 Vityaz air defense complex, which can theoretically track 100 surface contacts simultaneously within a radius of 400 kilometers, was calibrated for vessels displacing hundreds of tons. A semi-submersible running dark at 3 to 4 knots does not produce a track that a surface search radar crew would prioritize on a busy night watch. And Russian night watches had become very busy by the spring of 2026. The tanker targeted near Yalta in May of 2026 was a vessel on the international sanctions list, a member of the shadow fleet that Russia had assembled to bypass the G7 price cap mechanism. The Shadow Fleet by that point numbered somewhere between 600 and 700 vessels globally, according to reporting by Kiev School of Economics researchers and tracking firms, including Windward and Lloyd's List Intelligence. These were tankers that had been quietly purchased through opaque ownership structures registered in the UAE, Gabon, Palau, and a rotating cast of flag of convenience states. They carried Russian crude, Urals grade, Siberian light, and delivered it to Indian refineries, Chinese state buyers, and a network of middlemen operating out of ports in the Gulf and Southeast Asia. The Shadow Fleet was Russia's primary tool for sustaining oil export revenue after Western sanctions closed traditional European markets. Ukraine's naval drone campaign targeted the Shadow Fleet not by attempting to destroy hundreds of vessels, an impossible task, but by identifying which nodes of the logistics system were most sensitive to risk pricing. Here is what that means in practice, because this is where the mechanism becomes genuinely important to understand. A tanker owner operating in the Shadow Fleet faces three costs that conventional sanction busting had already baked into the business model: higher insurance premiums from specialty underwriters in the non-Western market, port fees at Russian terminals that had been recalibrated after major Western operators withdrew, and the reputational discount embedded in crude, priced below benchmark, to attract buyers willing to absorb the political risk. All of those costs were manageable by Shadow Fleet economics, so long as the physical risk to the hull remained bounded. The moment a vessel operating in the Black Sea faced a credible probability of a Ukrainian naval drone strike, not a certain strike, just a credible probability, the insurance arithmetic broke down. The strike near Yalta in May of 2026 was the trigger for that breakdown. Ukraine's security service and its main intelligence directorate confirmed the operation afterward, describing the target as a sanctioned vessel carrying Urals crude and anchored in what its operators apparently believed was a protected position under Russian air and coastal defense coverage. The Sea Baby unit that reached it had traveled approximately 280 kilometers from its launch zone, consistent with the operational range Ukraine's naval drone program had demonstrated publicly since the 2022 strike on the Kerch Bridge pontoon support structure. The warhead detonated against the vessel's port quarter, breaching the hull below the waterline and igniting a fuel-adjacent fire in the engine compartment. The tanker did not sink. It was towed to Sevastopol harbor, where, as of the time of this reporting, it remained out of service. What happened in the weeks after that strike was not a military event, it was a financial one. Within 10 days of the Yalta strike, 3 specialty insurance underwriters operating in the Dubai and Hong Kong markets quietly suspended new coverage for vessels transiting the Black Sea north of the 43rd parallel, the invisible line that passes roughly through the latitude of Novorossiysk and Yalta. A fourth underwriter raised its war risk premium for Black Sea transit to a figure that, combined with the existing sanctions discount on Urals crude and the port handling fees at Russian terminals, produced a net margin of less than $2 per barrel for a typical Shadow Fleet operator. At that margin, the voyage was no longer profitable. It was a business decision, not a political one. The drones had made the numbers stop working. Loading at Novorossiysk slowed within 2 weeks of the insurance pullback. Port data compiled by Kepler and Vortexa, 2 of the primary commodity tracking firms that had been monitoring Russian export flows since 2022, showed a drop of approximately 35% in loading volumes at the terminal between late May and the end of June 2026. Tankers that had been scheduled to load simply did not arrive. Operators citing force majeure clauses in charter agreements returned empty to anchorages in the eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean, where their vessels sat waiting for a resolution that showed no signs of arriving quickly. The crude that had already been loaded onto vessels in transit was stranded in a different way. 47 tankers, according to data compiled by Bloomberg's Commodities Desk as of the first week of July 2026, were positioned in holding patterns in the Black Sea or the Sea of Azov, their cargoes paid for and nominally owned by downstream buyers who could not accept delivery because the vessels could not safely transit to their destinations. The aggregate cargo across those 47 vessels represented approximately 135 million barrels of crude, valued at prevailing Urals discount prices in the range of $5.4 billion US. That crude was not generating revenue for the Russian state. It was simply sitting in hulls, depreciating in its commercial value with every day that market conditions did not resolve. The Russian Defense Ministry's response to the naval drone campaign was, by the summer of 2026, a familiar pattern of layered countermeasures that had repeatedly proven insufficient against the fundamental operational logic of the Sea Baby and Barracuda programs. Russian coastal defense in the Black Sea relied on a combination of fixed hydrophone arrays positioned along the Crimean coast, fast attack craft, Raptor-class patrol boats and Cerna-class landing craft converted to picket duty, and airborne coverage from Ka-27 naval helicopters operating out of Saki and Belbek airfields in Crimea. In theory, this network should have been capable of detecting and intercepting surface-running drone boats before they reached viable strike range of protected anchorages. In practice, the network had 4 critical vulnerabilities that Ukraine's drone operators had identified and exploited methodically across 3 years of operational iteration. The first was saturation. A Raptor-class patrol boat, displacing roughly 23 tons, armed with a 14.5mm heavy machine gun and an optional 30mm cannon, is fully capable of destroying a Sea Baby drone on the surface if the crew can acquire it visually, in daylight, or with thermal optics at night. The problem is that a single Raptor can only be in one place at a time, and Ukraine had demonstrated the ability to launch coordinated swarms of 8 to 12 drones simultaneously from multiple vectors, forcing patrol craft to choose which contact to intercept, and accepting that others would pass the picket line unengaged. The July 2023 attack on the Olenigorsky-Gornyak landing ship, which Ukraine struck with a Sea Baby in Novorossiysk harbor, established the operational template. By 2026, that template had been refined through dozens of subsequent operations. The second vulnerability was radar discrimination. The sea clutter problem, the tendency of surface search radar returns to fill with noise during even moderate wave action, created windows of effective invisibility for low-profile drone boats operating in conditions above Beaufort Scale 3. The Black Sea is not a calm body of water. Its prevailing wind patterns produce regular chop that degrades radar discrimination for small surface contacts to the point where a semi-submersible Barracuda variant becomes essentially invisible to a coastal defense operator scanning a busy screen. Russian crews had reportedly been issued standing orders to engage any anomalous return that could not be quickly resolved, but the standing orders had to compete with the volume of false positives generated by a sea state that produced hundreds of similar returns per watch hour. The third vulnerability was financial, and it operated at the strategic level rather than the tactical one. Russia's capacity to sustain combat losses across its entire military enterprise, ground forces, air forces, naval units, air defense networks, was contingent on the oil revenue that the drone campaign was now systematically degrading. The S-400 battalions guarding Crimea required spare parts. The Ka-27 helicopter fleet required maintenance cycles that depended on supply chains denominated in hard currency. The Raptor-class patrol boats required fuel. All of those requirements fed back to the same budget line, the line that was now being compressed by the stranded crude and the insurance pullback in the Black Sea. Oil and gas revenues accounted for approximately 31% of Russia's federal budget as measured in the 2025 fiscal year, according to Russia's own finance ministry publications. That percentage had already been declining from its pre-war highs as sanctions redirected sales to discounted Eastern markets. The drone campaign had introduced a new vector of compression, not through price mechanism or sanctions enforcement, but through the direct physical disruption of export logistics. Russia's finance ministry acknowledged in its June 2026 budget revision that export revenue projections for the third quarter had been reduced by approximately 12% relative to the second quarter forecast. The revision was attributed publicly to global commodity price movements. The analysts watching the Novorossiysk loading data understood what it actually reflected. What comes next in this campaign follows a logic that Ukraine's naval drone operators had established and had no strategic incentive to abandon. The infrastructure of the Shadow Fleet, its flag registries, its insurance networks, its port arrangements, can only absorb a finite number of strikes before the economic architecture collapses entirely. The Yalta strike in May, was the 15th confirmed Sea Baby or Barracuda operation in the Black Sea since the beginning of 2026. At the current operational tempo, the insurance market that sustains shadow fleet transit through the basin will face a pricing environment by the fourth quarter of 2026 that makes Russian crude export through Black Sea routes economically inviable without direct state subsidy of vessel risk. Russia has moved crude exports eastward through pipeline to China and overland routes to Belarus, and from there to buyers willing to absorb the political risk of transshipment. But pipeline capacity through the eastern route, primarily the Espoo pipeline serving Chinese refineries, was already running at capacity before the Black Sea disruption began. There is no short-term infrastructure solution that replaces the lost export volume from Novorossiysk. The crude will keep loading, or it will keep sitting in hulls in a sea that Ukraine has made into a financial obstacle course. Either outcome costs Moscow money it has already spent. The figure to watch in the coming months is not the drone count or the tanker count. It is the line item in Russia's third quarter budget execution report labeled Oil and Gas Non-Tax Revenues. When that number misses its projection by a margin large enough to require a budget amendment, and the data as of this reporting suggests it will, you will be reading the downstream financial consequence of operations that began with a GPS receiver, an electric motor, and a warhead the size of a small car. That is what 135 million stranded barrels actually represents. Not a naval victory in the traditional sense, not a fleet engagement or a harbor raid, a slow fiscal hemorrhage, compounding quarter by quarter, targeted with precision at the revenue stream that sustains the entire Russian war machine, executed by a country that has no conventional naval force capable of challenging Russian vessels in open water and did not need one. If you want to understand this war as it unfolds, not the noise, the strategy underneath the headlines, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you are there the moment the next chapter breaks. Hit the bell. And one final note for the record. This report is news analysis and reconstruction of ongoing, fast-moving events, built on reporting from major outlets, commodity tracking firms, and open-source intelligence, grounded in the facts as they are known at the time of writing. As the situation develops, details will change. Stay sharp, stay informed, and we will see you in the next one.